Welcome to the WP Builds podcast, bringing you the latest news from the WordPress community. Now, welcome your hosts, David Wormsley and Nathan Wrigley.
Hello there and welcome to the WP Builds podcast. You have reached episode number 327, which is episode 8 in our Thinking the Unthinkable series, and this episode is entitled, Is Open Source a Liability? It was published on Thursday the 18th of May 2023. My name's Nathan Wrigley and I'll be joined in a few moments by David Wormsley so that we can have our chat. But before then, a few bits of housekeeping. If you're into what WP Builds produce, why not subscribe? You can do that by going to wpbuilds.com/subscribe and you can find all of our social channels plus a couple of forms which you can use. And if you do that, we will send you an email when we produce some new content. If you feel like giving WP Builds a bit of a leg up, head over to your podcast player of choice, whatever platform you're on, Apple, Spotify, and give us a review. We'd really appreciate that. The other thing to mention is that at the moment I'm doing a webinar series with Mark Westgard from WS Form. You're able to find information about that, but typically it's going to be on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time. We're joined live by Mark and he's showing us increasingly complicated uses of his fabulous WS Form plugin. We'd love it if you came and joined us in the comments. Go to the wpbuilds.com homepage, scroll down a little bit and there'll be information about the next show. But as I say, it's on a Wednesday. The last thing to mention is our deals page. I say it every week, it's a bit like Black Friday, but every single day of the year. Significant coupon discount codes for WordPress products. Go and check it out, you never know. Search and filter, you may find something of interest to you. The WP Builds podcast is brought to you today by GoDaddy Pro. GoDaddy Pro, the home of managed WordPress hosting that includes free domain, SSL, and 24/7 support. Bundle that with the Hub by GoDaddy Pro to unlock more free benefits to manage multiple sites in one place. Invoice clients and get 30% off new purchases. You can find out more by heading to go.me/WP Builds. Once more, go.me/WP Builds, and sincere, heartfelt thanks to GoDaddy Pro for their continuing support of the WP Builds podcast. Okay, right at the top, I said that this show was all about open source being a liability. What do you think? Is it a good idea to base your entire business on freely available software? The problem is you don't really have any way of phoning home. If there's a problem, you just have to hope that somebody somewhere is going to fix it. In our case, we're using WordPress. It seems to be extremely well maintained. But what about all of the other bits and pieces that your websites are relying on? Linux, Nginx, Apache, all of the different things. We talk about some notable incidents in the past where governments around the world got incredibly worried because they couldn't pick up the bat phone when things like Log4j went haywire a little while ago. So there's lots to talk about. Is it a potential risk? How do you explain it to your clients? What are you all doing with open source? I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Hello, on this 8th episode of Thinking the Unthinkable, we're asking, is open source a liability? Nathan, you really kicked this one off by telling me a story from a couple of years ago about something that was a zero-day attack called Log4Shell.
Yes. This, I've got to say that we're probably straying into areas, in fact we certainly are straying into areas that I really don't understand, in that I don't really know what that does, but it would appear that whatever that is, Log4j, this Java logging library of Apache, that it's a truly crucial piece of server-side architecture, and yet there was a problem with it. It was running a significant proportion of sites on the internet, but when the problem was discovered, everybody was running around sort of Chicken Little style, you know, the sky is falling in, because apparently that project was being maintained, I'm going to say by an individual. I probably should have read up more about it, but it was certainly being maintained by a very tiny proportion of people, and yet the whole thing was utterly critical, and you've managed to find this perfect picture to describe it. But so imagine a castle built out of a variety of different Lego blocks, but more or less all of the castle is being held up by this one tiny Lego block, which is kind of sitting on its side. It's not properly embedded into the ground. And if you just knock that one tiny block out, then the entire edifice above it crumbles. And that's exactly what was going on. So the internet was being maintained, in this case, by one individual, and things go wrong. How do you find that individual? How do you compel that individual to fix the broken thing which is causing angst and anguish all over the internet? And the short answer is you don't. You just hope.
It was just, it's one of those kind of Mr. President, we've got a situation kind of things. One of the really big news for, I mean, I actually missed it. It was only you telling me about it. But I mean, it had the ability to really bring down, key players like Cloudflare and Microsoft, didn't it? And some of their big products and stuff. I mean, it was fixed and everybody just moves on with their lives. But, it's a good lead into this, how much do we depend on open source? And of course we do, because that's what WordPress is. And not only WordPress, it's really everything that WordPress depends on itself. The LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, PHP, MySQL, all open source projects.
Yeah, and you kind of forget that all of that is going on in the background. I mean, I don't mean you forget it, but you forget that it's created, that it's written, almost to the point where you just think, well, that's like a natural resource. It's just like water flowing down a river. It's there. It's always been there. It's available for everybody. You kind of forget that there's real humans donating significant amounts of their own time for free to make this stuff happen. But if you work in a corporate environment, let's say, I don't know, you're working for Microsoft or something like that, presumably there's a hierarchy of people above you who get to tell you what to do with your time. So if something is broken, then, okay, we need a patch for this. We've discovered a vulnerability and we'll release it in the next patch Tuesday for Windows, right? You, and you go and fix it and come back to me when it's done. In the open source world, it really isn't like that, is it? You just point into thin air and say, who can fix this? We don't know. Anybody Bueller? Anybody got any time? Anybody got any access to these projects? So it's really interesting. But I do think that the whole open source thing, I just take most of it for granted, assume it's going to work, assume it's up to date, assume that I'm allowed to use it for ever and ever and ever without mentioning anybody or praising anybody or donating any money or time. And in a sense, that's the way it's been built, but it's not necessarily bulletproof.
No. And I think, I've seen changes in the time that I've been with WordPress. So one of the key things that I did was make this kind of membership thing for my staff while I was working for the government, and they weren't very pleased about it, but then they made their own. But of course, when we're talking then back in those days, there was no way that a government department was going to use WordPress at all. That was simply not on. They had to use their own content management system where they were paying someone for it. But as I moved forward, and I guess people like Google putting out things like, supporting things like Android, it became accepted, that there were big players behind this. And obviously WordPress increased. And I noticed that difference in certain clients. So I was talking to somebody about, a theatre site, which I'm pretty sure in the past would have said, WordPress, no way, but now we'll say, well, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? it's what everybody's using. And I think, perceptions have changed. And I think, again, with this incident that happened a couple of years ago, it probably made a lot of people question that again, just going, oh, have we got a little bit too relaxed with it?
So just going back to your government job there, you were mentioning that WordPress or open source in general would have been out of the remit. In other words, there were rules and regulations precluding open source. Whereas if you went to a private company and they had their own CMS, that was possibly acceptable. Was it simply because there was if you like, there was a bat phone that you could pick up and enforce somebody to fix something if you discovered a problem? Was it around that?
Honestly, I don't know because I didn't have that level to understand their decision making, and obviously they had a deal already with the people who were supplying their content management system. But the implication of the conversations was that we couldn't just use any system outside apart from one that we got some kind of deal where the liabilities have been set, on that, what they're responsible for. So. Yeah, I think, but I imagine, I don't know because I left, but I imagine that was probably more relaxed later.
Yeah,
because that
it
seems to
kind
have
of
been a way.
feels like in the last period of time, and I don't really know what that is, but let's say the last decade, as if
Yeah.
there has been an inexorable move towards open source being acceptable, especially in government. I remember watching, or it's probably listening to the news on the radio not that long ago, where
Yeah.
they were talking about open source software in schools, because I think the thinking was that really a large amount of money had been spent in the Microsoft pot, getting every computer to run Windows. And whilst I'm sure they got preferential licenses because they're educational establishments, still the amount of money spent every year giving Microsoft money so that their products would work, where schools is not really mission critical. I don't mean that, that couldn't sound awful, but do you know what I mean? If the particular thing on a school computer breaks, we're not in a real terrible crisis. So things like using OpenOffice instead of the Microsoft Office suite, using things like Linux instead of Microsoft Windows. Now, I don't know if that all happened, but it was interesting that conversation was going on in the open. But I don't know if it was from a philosophical point of view or simply penny pinching. We can save a ton of money and there are these open source alternatives, so let's do that because it's going to save the whole state a ton of money paying out to Microsoft. I don't know if that was the prime motive or if it was more of a philosophical position of actually, why not? Let's advance open source. I doubt it was that. It feels like it would have been more about money.
Yeah. It's interesting, really. I mean, that's why we kind of have the peaks and troughs in just kind of anything in life with growth and stuff and economies, because we all get perhaps more comfortable with something at the point when it's probably the most risky. We reach the peak and then something happens, and I think that's what's happened with our trust in open source. It's varied. I'm certainly in that situation where I've now become more risk averse, so I'm really looking, and I guess this is what all this is about. Open source seems a wonderful thing, bringing all these people together, but it's down to you then to risk assess your dependency on them.
Yeah, and I guess you run the risk of trusting somebody with a critical piece of, in our case, your website, who really isn't able to maintain that. So they release it, it's GPL, but they don't have the time to maintain it, a bit like this Log4j thing. They don't have the time to maintain it. They don't have the interest to maintain it. They just did it. They put something out there, possibly because they built it for themselves, and then they thought, well, why not just let everybody have a go at it? But they're not intending to keep it going. And you see this all the time in WordPress, don't you? Plugins which haven't been updated for years and so get flagged. I mean, maybe there's nothing wrong with them, but just the fact that it hasn't been updated for ages. And if you're building your websites or your client websites on top of that, that does raise questions, but I'm not sure that conversation often happens. I think the conversation between clients and website builders is more, oh, it's free. There's all these great plugins and it's totally free. And the client's like, oh, great, it's going to cost me less. But then the whole commercial side of it, so plugins which you pay for, they're still GPL. You can, if you wish, go and find them in other less, nefarious ways, shall we say, and download them, and that's completely legitimate. But I guess the argument has always been, well, if you pay for it, you're going to get support and updates. That's kind of an interesting take on open source, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I look back really on 16 plus years of using WordPress, and that's, Linux, Apache, PHP, MySQL, the WordPress core, and a whole bunch of plugins. And I look back on this and I think, I've literally really had so few problems, only minor little problems. Everything's run quite smoothly on this. But then I'm reminded by somebody who's a potential client, and I looked at their site recently, and they're kind of stuck with one of those problems because they haven't updated their plugins, and some of them have reached the end of life because of the change with Gutenberg. And, they could have adjusted over time, but now they're stuck in this place where they can't update for security, and they can't really update, which they'll need to do soon, to the next PHP version. So they're stuck on PHP 7.4, which ended its life last year, and will stop running security patches during this year. So, and I suddenly think, wow, yeah, that's probably more like your average user. I've taken on the responsibilities because I kind of moved along with everything, and it seems problem free. I've moved along with my PHP versions. I've updated my SQL as I needed to go along, and not seen any issue. But yeah, for them, running on a LAMP stack with WordPress turned out to be quite a liability.
It's quite interesting, isn't it, how the open source projects, not just WordPress, but I think WordPress particularly, how there's definitely this clear definition between the commercial side of it and the pure open source side of it. So as an example, if you take Linux, an operating system is completely open. You can download it and modify it, and there's a whole bunch of variations. And yet, on top of that, you've got incredibly successful companies like Red Hat and a whole bunch of other ones who have made it their mission to bring that to the enterprise. So it's going to be cheaper than buying a proprietary license, but still they're going to make money. And in that way, they can then contribute back and make that project secure and successful and so on. And the same is true in WordPress. If you think about it, I wonder how WordPress could even exist if it weren't for the stewardship of, let's say, Automatic.
Yeah. So
Automatic, as you probably know, is a business, and it's run by, it's Matt Mullenweg's company, and it's a for-profit. It employs lots of people. Many of those people, because it's successful, can then contribute time back, and, there's a whole load of politics around that, but never mind. But my point being, would WordPress even survive if there wasn't a commercial, profitable wing keeping it going? And I don't know what the answer to that is.
I don't. And, I think it probably is true. I mean, effectively, WordPress.com is a hosting company, isn't it? And the money that it makes goes back into the main project and keeps it alive. And that's where we're at, I think, with it. And I don't think it would be a success without that. I don't know. But when you look at it, the other big successes, and that's why, if you like, big commercial companies have jumped on the whole idea of open source, is because it's the way to bring people to them,
Yeah. I don't know what the ratio is of contributions into WordPress core. There's probably a way of finding this out, and maybe I should have done that before this episode, but I don't know what the ratio of pure volunteerism is into, let's say, WordPress core as against contributed sponsored contributions. So let's say, I don't know, a hosting company who puts forward 5 employees for 10 hours a month or what have you. I don't know what that ratio is, and obviously that would be important to know.
Yeah. And I was talking earlier to you about the fact something that never really triggered in me before, but you kind of realize why not only Automatic would want to invest more in employing people to help, if you like, the open source project, but also why many hosting companies might want to also buy up plugins and stuff to have their own suite, because as it is effectively a way of getting in people for a hosting business, you want something which is going to attract the customers that are out there, the DIYs, particularly looking to be able to do it themselves. So it kind of makes a lot of sense, the direction that we've gone to me, or has only just done that recently for me, when I've kind of thought, what is the motivation for so many people acquiring plugins, particularly from hosting companies?
Do you want to develop that a little bit more? Because you sort of said quite a bit more than that when we were talking before, but maybe you want to keep that to yourself. I don't know.
I think it'll just come up. It was just a revelation, really. What was the motivation of so many hosting companies buying these, if you like, their own page builders on the Gutenberg project? And you just think, well, Automatic, probably for its own reasons, needs to make sure that WordPress becomes the sort of modern, more Wix-like platform, if you like, that's able to bring in people so everybody can publish. So it needs to do that, so it's investing its own money. But when you think about it, why are all the other hosting companies? Because they're in the same situation because of this massive move to edge hosting or serverless hosting, which could mean if everybody goes that way, we won't need this LAMP stack that everybody's required for so long to do dynamic work. So they're under threat. So, this is an alternative. So I suddenly realized to myself that that might be the motivation for hosting companies. They did really well in the early days of hosting when, most people who wanted to get online couldn't maintain their own server in-house. So they could grab a lot of people, but in those days, we needed a dynamic system that ran on something like a LAMP stack. And now that's been challenged a little bit as we go to this static site generation stuff, JavaScript being able to do more, the ability now to potentially skip servers altogether.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to revisit this in a year's time or 2 years' time and see whether that debate has been moved on. Because it does feel at the minute that like there is a bit of a groundswell of, certainly amongst the more technical users of WordPress, there's a lot of interest in different ways of hosting your website, and flattening and headless and all of those are definitely becoming more and more popular. I guess there's a technical burden there, isn't there? There's a little bit of learning to be undertaken. There's a new set of tools that need to be adopted, and but it does feel like it's becoming easier and easier, and those tools are becoming more and more accessible. And it feels like that's a real growth area, flattened websites, headless websites.
I know, and I don't think anything will ever, because there's always going to be people going to up their game. So as you can see already, there's interest automatically putting some money into how you might be able to have kind of serverless WordPress working in your browser and stuff. So it easily could go the same direction as well. So who knows? But you can see there is a clear challenge, and it makes much more sense to me why a lot of hosting companies want to buy a lot of these plugins and make a suite up that will run on WordPress, because it's just another way of attracting people.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to sit inside the boardrooms of some of those big hosting companies and see what their thoughts are on the 5-year plan and whether this is in fact figuring into it.
Hey, there's something that you mentioned to me which I thought was the greatest thing that you said about this topic, when that was, you asked the question, is HTML and CSS open source? Because that really changes everything.
That's so weird that I've never even thought about that. It's there. It's been there forever. You can use HTML, you can use CSS. All you need to do is find tutorials. But I don't really have much insight into how those projects are created, who gets to commit to them, who decides. I mean, I know it's and I always get this wrong, W3C, is that right? Or is it the WC3? I can never get that. Who decides all of this stuff? And is it open source? And if it is open source, what does that even mean in this context?
I know, it's really, and I mean, we Googled it, and I'm not sure if we got a clear answer. There were certainly people saying, yes, it is open source. But, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's it's still headed by Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. So it is World Wide Web. So the W3 consortium, isn't it? So it's a World Wide Web consortium, and it's still founded by him. And I guess, I don't know how it is run, how the board is run, but of course it has to run. And another thing that was significant for the web was the first open source browsers, which is the way forward. And now those who run those open source browsers now have to kind of work with the W3C, don't they, to move forward how the web will go. So they have a say in, because obviously there's no point in coming up with new ways to do clever stuff with CSS if the browsers aren't going to support them. Yeah. And we've moved into a new era where for the first time in the last year or so, browsers have decided to work together rather than compete with each other.
This is singularly the best thing that ever happened to the internet. Just you and I can both remember back in the day where Microsoft had their browser and along came Mozilla and had an open source browser, and that for a period was in the ascendancy, and then Google came and quickly dominated with their open source Chromium or Chrome browser. And what a change that made, not having to worry about, well, if they've got a subset of users using this particular version of this particular browser, we have to inject this little bit of code to patch that and put a little band-aid over it. All of that, that's so great, and that really does speak to the power of open source and the trust that's been put in it.
Yeah. But it does make you wonder. I mean, I was talking about liabilities is probably the key thing, or dependencies that you build on it. I mean, we are absolutely dependent on the W3C, and I have no clue about, who holds any responsibility for the future of HTML and CSS, JavaScript itself. Absolutely none at all. I've just put my trust in it.
Yeah, the same would be basic things like DNS. I don't really have any understanding of who governs all of that. I know that they meet occasionally in a room and exchange keys and things like that, but beyond that, I've no idea who decides all of that stuff. And it just seems to get better, though. I don't really remember any debate, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe there was, but I don't seem to remember any debate about people getting all het up and worried about, well, they're going to include this in the CSS spec. They're going to add this thing. It's going to be the end of the world. It always seems to be a case of, oh, they're going to add this thing. Oh, that's great. Look, we get to do this new thing like clamp or something like that. Brilliant. We've got a new thing. Never, oh, why do they keep bloating CSS? It's funny how that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have seen a massive change. I mean, I think in some ways I see the open source of the WordPress as more of a liability than I have before, because it's trying to stay relevant, and so that makes it a little bit unstable for me and the type of work I do. And also because of the challenge that's coming to that traditional LAMP stack, the fact that those who have always been critical of Apache and how these kind of systems work have helped to develop this way of being able to use JavaScript to do dynamic stuff in the user's browser. And that's clearly going to be the way forward. So there is going to have to be a shift in that way with the kind of edge. So in some ways, a lot of the open source I knew, and what I think of as open source, has become more of a liability. But literally everything I do to escape those kind of dependencies leads me back to open source.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. If we take the subject of this particular episode, which is open source a liability? I've just had a thought. Is our job basically to stand between the open source and the client? So the open source is great for us because we get this free suite of tools in every regard, HTML, CSS, DNS, LAMP stack, and in this case, WordPress. We put all of that, it's this great big heap of open source. And essentially what our job is to do is to understand that and give our clients an experience which means they don't have to care about the open source. You are basically insulating. If something goes wrong with WordPress, it's your job to understand that and get it fixed. If something goes wrong with the server, you're probably by proxy paying somebody to understand that and fix it on your behalf. If something goes wrong with DNS, well, we're all screwed. So you can probably just forget about that one. But this is our job, is to consume these free tools, offer them up to the client, and stand as the guardian to fix things when they go wrong and to understand when things go wrong, to be abreast of the news in the open source communities, the WordPress news, and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that is quite interesting is that with deprecating stuff, so when you rely on it, you're hoping that it's going to work forever, but obviously everything has to develop. But one thing that when you come to HTML and CSS, they have deprecated, certainly when we've gone to HTML4 to 5, there were some things that were clearly deprecated there. But have you ever seen these not work in browsers? They all seem to work forever.
No, there's all sorts of things that have been deprecated over the years. I'm actually struggling to think of anything, but You know, so for
bold,
example,
strong instead of bold.
yes, that's a perfect example. And yet, doesn't it break with that in mind? In other words, look, it's better if you stop using that tag. But for now, at least, anyway, we're just going to honour it because it would be insane to break 100% of the websites out there. But hopefully over time, those websites will be re-engineered, rebuilt a few years later to the point where everybody knows. But I've not really seen any of those things being switched off. In other words, that tag no longer works. It will literally do nothing. It feels like it's more a question of, well, we've got this better thing, but we'll deprecate it, I guess, elegantly might be a good way of describing it. Yeah, I can't think of a single example where I've seen things break as a result.
Yeah. I mean, I think my stack at the moment is a very nice one, going the static route for clients that can be static. You know, using WordPress, it's helping me to build the sites, which turn into HTML. But, you know, I can also do it through VS Code, again, another open source project, with GitHub, yet another open source project. And with these tools, I feel like I've escaped pretty much all the dependencies, but when you really think about
I
it,
was going to say,
I haven't at all.
Yeah, you've just got a different set of dependencies. And the curious thing is that because you've been in the WordPress space for so long and you've really dug deeply into that community, all of the weirdness and the disagreements and the controversies, they're available to you. You know them all. But you probably don't know that there's a ton of people in the GitHub community. I'm just making this up, by the way.
Well, there is actually.
Who just disagree, and there'll be politics there, and there'll be politics everywhere, but you're just not aware of it. So it seems like, oh, this is pure. GitHub is pure. Nobody's arguing with that. But dig deep enough, and I suspect, like everything else, because it's adapting, because it's changing, because it's morphing, and there's probably there might be an individual in charge. You know, I'm thinking of Linus in terms of GitHub. But there'll be debates and there'll be confusion and there'll be angst and all of that everywhere, I would have thought. And you just have to swap the WordPress controversies for other controversies.
Yeah. I mean, certainly if GitHub is yanked from me, that causes a real problem. It doesn't, it means that everything I've done still lives on because it's static and can be dumped on any server, really, or just used in the browser locally. So in some ways I've removed a whole bunch of them, but still how I would run the business is still going to be impeded greatly.
Yeah, I mean, truly, if you were to build a dependency-free website, you really are inside of an open source text editor, like something like Notepad++ on Windows, and you're writing absolutely everything yourself. You're not dependent upon any JavaScript libraries. You're not dependent on anything else. It's just HTML, CSS, and your own bespoke JavaScript, and you're going to upload that to a server somewhere, and you're going to maintain it, and it's going to be hell.
I think you're right, though, about that. That is our job, to kind of protect, if you like, clients who come to us from the open source. And I think that runs into something which we didn't talk about, which is other liabilities when you join a platform, GDPR, accessibility, things like that. Debates we've had in WordPress about, should everyone be forced to take their Google fonts out of their themes, that are tapping into Google's own API, because of cases and all of that sort of stuff. But really, I guess that is our job, isn't it, to do that? And if clients do it themselves, they take that responsibility on.
I don't really know truly what the definition of something being absolutely open source is, but it feels like you can download a copy of it. You can then modify it, and you can then, with, I guess, some level of attribution, you can then use that in whichever way you see fit. How do you feel that WordPress itself stacks up in that? Because we do have the whole benevolent dictator for life model. We've got Matt, who makes a lot of these decisions, and it is open source. You can download it, you can fork it. Classic Press was an example, which seems to be limited in terms of its shelf life going forwards. I could be wrong about that. Maybe I am. But how do you feel about the true open source nature of WordPress itself?
I think, they've definitely been played up, the four freedoms of GPL and WordPress's, role in that, which is significant. But I do feel at the moment, because it's become such a complex system, it's a little bit more marketing, because realistically, you're not going to take away the modern WordPress and manage it yourself. It's already got kind of 4,000 issues against it on the project, and something close to 1,000 bugs at any point. So I mean, you'd have to be quite a huge organization to really say, I'm going to take WordPress as even earlier than that, as the classic press tried to do, and they've not really been able to kind of bring that together and do a fork of it. So so I think the 4 freedoms there, I mean, it's kind of a philosophical stance, isn't it? I mean, I think both you and I like the idea of open source. It seems a kind of honest thing, but in practical terms, I don't think there isn't a freedom there.
Yeah, I guess software gets there's some critical moment where the seesaw tips, where it's just impractical for it to be forkable, and obviously you can, but well, hang on, let me rewind that. You can fork it whenever you like. Nobody's saying you can't, but in order for it to function in the normal way that most people use it for, there's just some sort of weight pushing you. There's the gravity dragging you back to the, in inverted commas, the official repository, because there's just too many things, too many lines of code, too much to inspect, and all of that kind of thing. I guess that's the case with WordPress. You really are going to struggle, unless you've got a very, very big and dedicated team. You're going to struggle to fork WordPress and use it reliably over time. And I guess that's just the nature of open source. At some point, people coalesce on a version of it, a company that's maintaining it, a repository of it, and that's the official version. So we go to WordPress.org to download WordPress. Most of us don't go to Classic Press to download WordPress.
And I think because of how you can't do this, it's the same as the client I mentioned earlier, or potential client who's stuck on the PHP 7.4, because it's all dependent on another open source project, which also I think maybe is speeding up on the how quickly it kind of updates to remain relevant itself. So you take it off, and then you're really going to have to work with all of that code to see what's going to what's deprecated in the new version, because you're going to need to update, because PHP isn't going to keep patching for security after a certain point. So I think in that sense, that kind of freedom it's kind of a commitment, I guess, to sharing the code with other people to contribute. But in terms of anybody saying, I can take this and make my own, it's not practical, is it?
No. Yeah, that's a good point. Right at the bottom of this list of things that we were going to talk about today is what open source stuff do we use? I'm curious to know what's on your computer, or what do you use?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a really good question. And well, I guess there's lots. Is Notepad++? In fact, that's the first thing I just looked at.
I think it is, but I could be wrong about that. I've got a feeling. I don't use Windows anymore, but I remember in the day I could just simply download it. That's not to say it's open source, but I remember that I could just freely download it and use it. So that's where I'm getting that from.
So there's Note++, and I'm going through all my icons here. We also have, for my media, I have VLC.
Oh yeah,
Media
me
Player.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think most people have that. I also have FileZilla for my FTP. I also have Audacity for any audio recording, and that's it. I have a few other things here that are buried away. I have a terrible, I'm going to have to find another one. There isn't a good open source software for us Windows users that does photos, because I don't like what Windows does, because it tries to upsell you stuff.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, you're good, though. You've got loads of stuff. I have definitely got VLC. In fact, I make sure that on the Mac, anything which is using playback of audio runs through VLC, but I use proprietary software for editing, so I use Logic, so I'm not even using Audacity. The only other things really is I've got I'm using Mastodon. That's an open source sort of social network. I've got an app called Handbrake, which allows me to compress video.
Me too.
To make it, to take it from a big video to a small video. And then it's browsers. That's all. I've got every variant of every browser, but that's the only open source stuff that I'm using, really. I got suckered into the Mac ecosystem. So I'm on the computer at the moment. I got suckered into the Mac ecosystem and I've spent money on more or less everything. And dare I say it, I think in most cases, the commercial variants are just easier to use. And because they're easier to use, I'm going to say that they're better. I'm going to get shot.
Yeah, well, although we're touching on what we talked about before, because when we think of open source, we are going back to old school thinking, something that we put on our operating systems. But we were talking about things like Penpot, which is open source,
yes,
which is that design thing, which is in the browser. So a lot of the open source stuff is stuff that, I guess I use a whole load more. That's the only one I could think of. So
most things on the internet require some subscription these days, don't they? So it's harder and harder to find. The only other thing, which is not my computer, but you mentioned it earlier, perhaps before we clicked record, is I use Android for my mobile operating system. So I've got an Android phone. I know there's some debate about whether Android itself is truly open source. It's something to do with whether or not you can commit back to the project. And my understanding is that you need to be granted all sorts of permissions and access in order to do that. But you can download it and fork it. But it's a bit like WordPress. It's so big that I don't suppose anybody apart from major companies like Samsung and what have you are even able to get into the weeds of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're near the end. Did we come to a
so.
Conclusion? Is it a liability? What do we say?
Do you know what? I think for critical stuff and your government, I think you could easily argue the case that it's a liability. The fact that your citizens' access to the internet is going down and you have absolutely no way to troubleshoot the stack because, as the cartoon that we mentioned to earlier, which I'll put in the show notes, said, some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining a crucial component of that infrastructure, and you don't know what, he's on a camping trip and is uncontactable. That is a liability. You'd imagine that in the Pentagon and GCHQ in the UK, they want the bat phone. They want to be able to say, well, something's gone wrong, pick up the bat phone, talk to the person, get it fixed at the point of a gun, if you know what I mean. Literally, you're in trouble unless you do this now. I would imagine that that's a great argument. But for me, given that nothing is mission critical particularly, no, it's not a liability. It's totally the opposite. It's great.
Yeah, I've got nothing more to add to that. That sums it up. Yeah, it's as much as you allow it to be a liability, really, isn't it? Right. Okay.
Yeah. So we don't know what we're doing next, but we do have written down WordPress is expensive. So maybe let's do
we'll
that.
We'll probably do that.
All right. Well, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Cheers.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that. As always, a pleasure chatting to David about this topic. Is open source a liability? What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Did we miss something out? Head over to the wpbuilds.com website, search for episode number 327 and leave us a comment there. Please join us on Monday for our This Week in WordPress show. We do that live every week, 2 p.m. UK time, and you can leave some comments if you like, and we'll hopefully address those in the show. Also, on Wednesday, we'll be having our Chat with Mark, the webinar series about WS Form. Please join us for that as well and leave some comments. Both of those can be found at wpbuilds.com/live at the appropriate time, and we'd really like your participation. The WP Builds podcast was brought to you today by GoDaddy Pro. GoDaddy Pro, the home of managed WordPress hosting that includes free domain, SSL, and 24/7 support. Bundle that with the Hub by GoDaddy Pro to unlock more free benefits to manage multiple sites in one place. Invoice clients and get 30% off new purchases. You can find out more by heading to go.me/WP Builds. And we thank GoDaddy Pro for their support of the WP Builds podcast. Okay, we will be back next week for a podcast episode. It'll be an interview. Like I said, back on Monday. The primary objective, though, is that you stay safe. Have a good week. Cheesy music fading in. Bye-bye for now.